This is part two of a presentation I originally gave at the 2020 Sunstone Symposium. Part two, Tacfarinas. The Latro Tacfarinas began vexing the Romans early in the 1st century AD. Roman historian Tacitus provides the details in his Annals of Imperial Rome. Tacfarinas was a native tribesman of North Africa who had deserted from the Roman army, where he had served as an auxiliary. Quote, his first followers were vagabonds and marauders who came for loot. Then he organized them into army units in formation, and was finally recognized as the chief no longer of an undisciplined gang, but of the Musulman people, a powerful nomad tribe on the edge of the African desert. End quote. He was considered a latro partly because he engaged in guerrilla warfare, which the Romans called latrocinium. A key to understanding the conflicts with Tacfarinas as related by Tacitus is Sallust's monograph, The Jugurthine War. Sallust had served as governor of Africa and was familiar with the geography, terrain, and the native peoples. Modern historiographers have noted similarities between Tacitus's account and Sallust's monograph, even going so far as saying that Tacitus, quote, imitates Sallust by describing the war in terms of the Jugurthine War, end quote. The Jugurthine War had occurred about 130 years earlier, but many of Sallust's details about tactics and terrain help us better understand the nature of the conflict with Tacfarinas. In part 1, I compared the Catilinarian conspiracies to events in the Book of Mormon found in Helaman chapters 1, 2, and the first part of chapter 11. In part 2, I make a comparison to the war with Tacfarinas by looking at the last part of Helaman 11 and chapters 1 through 6 of 3rd Nephi. Helaman 11 is a transitional chapter with the Gadianton robbers. When first formed, they were Nephite insiders looking to obtain the reins of government. They were eventually successful in taking over the government, but were ultimately extinguished in the first part of the chapter. Later in Helaman 11, they formed again. This new incarnation of Gadianton robbers lived in the mountains and roamed the countryside, killing and plundering. These are the robbers that resemble Tacfarinas and his men. Combatants. Three main groups were involved in the ancient Roman conflict. The Romans and Tacfarinas' armies were the primary combatants, but the North African kingdom of Mauritania eventually became involved as well. The Mauritanians were ruled by their own king, but were a client state of the Roman Empire. In the final year of the conflict, the Romans found themselves outnumbered and called on King Ptolemy of Mauritania for help. His armies were instrumental in the final victory over Tacfarinas. The king was awarded by the Romans for his assistance. Quote, then, in recognition of the loyal conduct of King Ptolemy of Mauritania during the hostilities, an ancient compliment was revived, and a senator dispatched to award him an ivory scepter and embroidered triumphal robe, and greet him as king, ally, and friend. End quote. The Book of Mormon events similarly have three main groups involved in the conflicts. The Nephites fought against the Gadianton robbers and were aided by the Lamanites, a people with whom they normally had an adversarial relationship. The faithful Lamanites were rewarded for their assistance, quote, and their curse was taken from them, and their skin became white like unto the Nephites, and their young men and their daughters became exceedingly fair, and they were numbered among the Nephites, and were called Nephites. These and other similarities are summarized in the following table. So, from the Annals of Tacitus, we have the Romans, who were, of course, European. The Book of Mormon, we've got the Nephites, who had white skin. The Romans had an agricultural-based economy and walled cities. The Nephites, similarly, had an agricultural-based economy in walled cities. Both governments, the Romans and the Nephites, contained republican elements, and the conflict was related from the point of view of the Roman historian Tacitus, and in the Book of Mormon from the point of view of the Nephite historian Mormon. So we move on to the next group of combatants. We have Tacfarinas' armies, who were the Latrones, and then the Gadianton robbers, who were obviously robbers. And again, we've discussed why these words are equivalent. Tacfarinas' armies lived in the mountains and deserts. The Gadianton robber armies lived in the mountains and wilderness. Tacfarinas' armies were composed of Roman deserters and Mauritanians, so groups from the other two, or people from the other two groups. The Gadianton robbers also contained people from the other two groups, as they included Nephite dissenters and Lamanites. Tacfarinas' armies were pastoralist tribesmen. Now, the Gadianton robber armies, we don't have a lot of information on them as far as whether they were pastoralists or farmers, but we do have a little hint in the fact that they all wore lambskins into battle. Remember, lambskins dyed in blood, and so this suggests that they possibly were also pastoralist tribesmen. Third group here from the ancient Roman account were the Mauritanians. They were African natives who had a king. The third group in the Book of Mormon would be the Lamanites, who have, quote, a skin of blackness and also had a king. The Mauritanians were a client state of Rome. Now, Rome had many client states throughout its history. Not all of the client states were friendly. At times, the client states rebelled and tried to get out from underneath the Romans, but that wasn't the case here with the Mauritanians. They ended up allying with Rome against Tacfarinas. The Lamanites were normally adversarial to the Nephites, as we know, but in this case they allied with the Nephites against the Gadianton robbers. Because of his assistance, the Mauritanian king was rewarded. He was honorably referred to as ally and friend of the Roman people. We see that the Lamanites who had assisted the Nephites were numbered among the Nephites and called Nephites. The Mauritanian king was awarded a triumphal robe and ivory scepter. The Lamanites who had assisted the Nephites became exceedingly fair, and skin became white. I can't help but think that there's a metaphorical association between those two things. Okay, moving on to tactics. Tacfarinas and his followers came onto the scene committing nomad raids and destroying villages and looting extensively. In the first major confrontation between Tacfarinas and the Roman commander coaxed the Latrones into a conventional battle and routed them with a smaller army. After that, Tacfarinas conducted a guerrilla campaign, giving way under pressure and then attacking from the rear. The natives' mastery of the terrain allowed them to descend from their hiding places in the hills and the wilderness, where they could quickly retreat to avoid retaliation from the slower conventional Roman forces. Sallust relates that the Romans tried in vain to attack a Numidian fortress in the desert. Because of the fortress's natural protection, being in an isolated area on the edge of a mountain precipice and protected by a muddy swamp in the winter, the Romans, masters of siege warfare, were unsuccessful. The Book of Mormon describes Gadianton robber tactics very similar to Tacfarinas' armies. From Helaman 11:25, quote, "And they did commit murder and plunder, and then they would retreat back into the mountains and into the wilderness and secret places, hiding themselves that they could not be discovered." From 3 Nephi 1:27, quote, save it were for the Gadianton robbers who dwelt upon the mountains, who did infest the land, for so strong were their holds and their secret places that the people could not overpower them. From 3 Nephi 2:11, quote, For the Gadianton robbers had become so numerous, and did slay so many of the people, and did lay waste so many cities, and did spread so much death and carnage throughout the land. From 3 Nephi 4:1, quote, Those armies of robbers had prepared for battle, and began to come down, and to sally forth from the hills, and out of the mountains, and the wilderness, and their strongholds, and their secret places. In addition to guerrilla tactics, the Latrones tried their hands at siege warfare. In their first attempt, they had some success in a conventional battle when the Romans refused to stay hidden behind their walls. The next attempt at siege warfare against the Romans did not fare as well for Tacfarinas' armies. The Romans defeated them with a much smaller army, by again choosing to attack the besiegers on the open battlefield. After this defeat, the Numidians stuck to guerrilla tactics. The Gadianton robbers also tried their hands at siege warfare against the Nephites. And like the Romans, the Nephites didn't simply wait behind their fortifications. Instead, they marched out and met their enemies in a series of battles in the open field. In this manner, they were able to inflict massive losses upon the Gadianton robbers. Eventually, the Gadianton robbers gave up the siege when their own provisions ran too low. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the tactics used both in the battle against Tacfarinas and with the Gadianton robbers. We see that the Latrones killed civilians, burned and destroyed villages, committed raids and looted extensively, conducted guerrilla warfare against the Romans. They had mountain desert hiding places and strongholds, limited success at siege warfare, and retreated to the desert when they needed to. The Gadianton robbers similarly killed civilians for the cause of great destruction, laid waste many cities, plundered and robbed extensively. They conducted guerrilla warfare against the Nephites. They had mountain wilderness hiding places and strongholds. They were unsuccessful at siege warfare and retreated to the wilderness and mountains. On the Roman part, they were victorious in the initial battle and superior in conventional battles. This is the same as the Nephites. They were also victorious in the initial battle and recognized that they were superior in conventional battles. When besieged, the Romans, rather than trying to wait out the siege, recognizing their advantage in conventional warfare, countered the besiegers with direct attacks. This is also how the Nephites dealt with the Gadianton robber sieges. The Romans were unable to defeat a Numidian mountain fortress. Nephites, we know as well, could not overpower the Gadianton robbers from their mountain strongholds. Okay, attempted diplomacy. Gadianton, the leader of the Gadianton robbers, sent Laconius, chief judge and governor of the Nephites, a bold letter. The plight of Gadianton's men, as related by his letter, provides an interesting contrast to the picture painted by Mormon. Mormon portrays the robbers in solely negative terms. They were dissenters who murdered and plundered, took women and children captive, and destroyed cities. They were evil conspirators whose purpose was to enrich themselves on the labors of others. Gadianton, on his part, related that his people had been repeatedly wronged by the Nephites and accused the Nephites of denying his people their rights of government. Gadianton offered to cease hostilities with Laconius. The Nephites could become their brethren and partners of their substance if they would take an oath of peace. The conditions were that the Nephites give up their cities, lands, and possessions without the shedding of blood. The alternative, wrote Gadianton, was nothing less than a war of extinction. Laconius was quote, exceedingly astonished by this correspondence because of its boldness and lies. Mormon tells us that Laconius was a, quote, just man and could not be frightened by a robber. Gadianton was the head of a fearsome army, but he was hardly a king or head of state of a legitimate nation. Perhaps Laconius did not consider it just, according to his understanding of the rules of warfare, to deal on even terms with a mere robber. Tacitus relates a similar incident in which Tacfarinas attempted to negotiate peace with the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Quote, Tacfarinas was insolent enough to send representatives to Tiberius demanding land for himself and his army. As the alternative, he offered endless war. No personal or national slur, it is said, ever provoked the emperor more than the sight of this deserter and bandit behaving like a hostile sovereign. Even Spartacus, reflected Tiberius, burning Italy unavenged, at a time when he had destroyed consuls' armies and the nation was convulsed by terrible wars overseas against Quintus Sertorius and Mithridates VI of Pontus, had not been allowed conditions for his surrender. And now, with Roman power at its height, was this Latro Tacfarinas to be bought off by a treaty granting lands? Although a treaty granting lands seemed preposterous to the emperor, it would have been logical to the native North African pastoralists in Tacfarinas' army. It may be that their traditional grazing lands were being encroached upon or controlled by the Romans. It's natural they would attempt to reclaim access to these lands. Here's a side-by-side comparison of both these attempts at diplomacy, if you can call them that. Tacfarinas, who was the Latro leader, he didn't attempt to negotiate with the provincial governor. Instead, he sent emissaries directly to the emperor in the capital, Rome. Gadianton, who was the Gadianton robber leader, didn't attempt to negotiate with the local commander, and he as well sent a letter to the chief judge and governor in the capital, Zarahemla. So both of them went right to the top. Tacfarinas offered peace in exchange for land. Gadianton offered peace in exchange for Nephite cities, lands, and possessions. Tacfarinas threatened endless war if his offer was refused. Gadianton threatened utter destruction and extinction if his offer was refused. Tacfarinas claimed to be fighting a war of liberation. He urged his soldiery, quote, all who preferred freedom to slavery, to make a united effort to drive out the Romans. And Gadianton claimed that the Nephites had usurped his people's rights and government, and that they were making war to reclaim these rights. On the other side, we have Tiberius, the Roman emperor, and Laconius, the Nephite chief judge. Tiberius was angry and insulted that a mere Latro was trying to negotiate with him as if a hostile sovereign. Laconius was exceedingly astonished and could not be frightened by the demands and the threatenings of a robber. Okay, final victory. The Romans became frustrated at being unable to confront the armies of Tacfarinas in a pitched battle. Finally, after receiving intelligence about the location of Tacfarinas, the Romans dispatched fast-moving troops in the dark of night. At dawn they attacked. Quote, the enemy were taken unawares. They had no weapons, order, or plans, and were dragged to death or captivity like sheep. End quote. The Romans sought out Tacfarinas in the conflict and were able to surround him and his guards. Tacfarinas escaped captivity by rushing the Roman armies, suffering mortal wounds at the points of their weapons. The Romans won a decisive victory, slaughtering or taking prisoner many Latrones. The Nephites used a similar ploy to defeat the Gadianton robbers. Gadianton knew ahead of time where the enemies were marching and sent out Nephite armies in the nighttime to surround them. In the morning, when the Gadianton robbers began their march, they were met on every side by the Nephite armies. This prevented the Gadianton robbers from retreating into the wilderness as they were accustomed to doing under direct attack from the Nephites. The Nephites were able to capture the leader Zemnariah, who did not receive an honorable warrior's death like Tacfarinas. Instead, he was executed by hanging. The decisively defeated Gadianton robbers were all slain or taken captive. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the final victories. The Romans received intelligence about Tacfarinas' location. In the Book of Mormon, they had foreknowledge, maybe prophetic foreknowledge, of Gadianton robber movements. Both the Romans and Nephites did a secret night march, and the Romans had a dawn raid. The Nephites a morning surprise attack. I suppose those are equivalently the same things. As soon as the sun came up, they attacked. The Romans killed the enemy leader. The Nephites also killed the enemy leader, though again the Gadianton robber leader didn't receive this honorable death. The final result was decisive victory, resulting in massive enemy casualties and prisoners, and that was the same for both the Romans and the Nephites. Okay, seven years of war. The Gadianton robbers began to make war from their hiding places in the mountains about 12 years before the birth of Christ. Continuing conflicts are mentioned in the 11th year before Christ's birth, and then again in the 1st, 2nd, and 13th through 15th years. In the 16th year, Laconius received Gadianton's letter. Laconius sent out a proclamation, and by the end of the 17th year, the Nephites had gathered in one place with 7 years of provisions. This was the beginning of their final stand against the Gadianton robbers. In the 18th year, the Gadianton robbers began to take possession of the vacated Nephite lands, and battle commenced in the 19th year. Depending on which event is considered the starting point, this final war began sometime between the 17th and 19th year after Christ's birth. There were several conflicts with North African tribesmen in the years leading up to the war with Tacfarinas. The war with Tacfarinas lasted about 7 years, from 17 AD to 24 AD. This is practically identical to the time period of the Nephite last stand. It's difficult to say with certainty, though, in which year the fighting against the Gadianton robbers ended. The Lamanites began their siege in the 21st year. After the final Nephite victory, they preached the word to the captured Gadianton robbers and either punished them or released them into society, depending on whether they were truly repentant. At that point, Mormon tells us that they had put an end to the Gadianton robbers, and then immediately says that the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th years had passed away. In the 26th year, the people returned to their lands. It's possible the fighting ended in any of the years between the 21st and 25th, depending on how long it took to preach to the captured Gadianton robbers and sort out those that needed punishment. The fact they still had provisions remaining as they headed home in the 26th year gives us a hint to how long this business with the prisoners may have taken. The Nephites managed to last a little longer than 8 years, with only 7 years of provisions, while still having some left over. Since they would have also had to feed many thousands of prisoners, it's likely they weren't kept for long. It seems likely the end of the fighting came in the 25th year, and that the prisoners were dealt with quickly that same year. In showing the near identical dating of these events, I remind the viewer that the actual year of Christ's birth is unknown, though most commentators have given dates between 7 BC and 1 BC, with modern scholarship indicating it likely occurred in 4 BC or earlier. Classical understanding based on Luke 3, however, puts Christ's birth in 3 or 2 BC. Using a birth date of 2 BC and putting the beginning of the war in the 18th year When the Gadianton robbers began to sally forth from the mountains, these two 7-year conflicts have the exact same starting and ending years. Here's the side-by-side comparison of the two 7-year conflicts. First of all, there were sporadic hostilities that led up to the final conflict. This was true in both the Roman events and the Book of Mormon events. In the Roman events, we know the dates from the historians, and we know that the war with Tacfarinas started in 17 AD. In the Book of Mormon, I've got the years listed there as the years after Christ's birth. And so on the 17th year after Christ's birth, the Nephites gathered together with 7 years of provisions. In the 18th year, the Gadianton robbers begin to take Nephite lands. And in the 19th year, battle begins between the Nephites and Gadianton robbers. Again, if we look at 2 BC as being the birth of Christ based on the New Testament, then the 18th year would correspond to 17 AD. From the Roman sources, from Tacitus sources, we know that the Romans decisively defeat Tacfarinas' armies in 24 AD, killing him in the process and putting an end to native resistance in North Africa. In the Book of Mormon, I think it was likely the 25th year that the Nephites decisively defeat the Gadianton robbers, killing their leader in the process. And we know that it was in the 25th year where Mormon says the Nephites put an end to secret combinations. So again, the 25th year with a birth date of 2 BC would correspond with 24 AD.